Today, we're talking with James Clement, rancher, Marine, and the guy leading soil strategy at Earth Optics. We're digging into soil health, carbon credits, remote monitoring, and how ag tech can serve the land, not the other way around. James, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jonathan. Good to be here.
You're a rancher, you're a Marine, currently serving in the reserves, and a tech exec. How do these three worlds collide?
More so every day, I guess. It was really probably my brother went to Naval Academy. I was already ranching post college, and it was an itch I wanted to scratch. So I left for Marines, was in the reserves originally, came back to ranching, and then hadn't scratched enough. So went back, and now 18 years later, still in the reserves and gotten to go to a few places and serve as an infantry officer. And then on the ag tech side, that kind of came from as I was trying to learn more about ranching outside of cattle and horses. I always tell people I don't really have a hobby. So my hobbies are filled with raising horses or trying to grow more cattle opportunities. I became a Texas landman. I started looking at all the other ways that ranches can be impacted from a health standpoint, from a cost standpoint, or they can be benefited from third party kind of infiltration, if you will. And as I looked at all these other opportunities out there, I really appreciated the soil carbon as the first intro and then kind of the soil health discussion overall. And then that's kind of brought me into kind of a lot of other natural resource and livestock management tools that are out there.
So, can you walk us through your family's? You've got 400 years worth of ranching legacy, and how has that shaped your perspective on land stewardship?
Yes, sir. Beggs Cattle Company is my mother's family. Next year is our 150th year in ranching. My father's family, King Ranch, and I lived down here in South Texas, and I worked there for 10 years. And I continue to be involved with both operations in kind of different ways. The third operation, my grandfather started in 1967. My uncle and dad took it over, and that's where we kind of started my personal, and my siblings are involved, my parents are involved, but then I also have some partners, so kind of different herds, different folks. And so for the last 15 years, kind of when the Marine Corps wasn't pulling me away, I was able to kind of build up a personal cattle operation too. So the way it makes me think, and Dave Delaney, an old boss of mine that was at King Ranch, he said, every decision I make is a 100-year decision. And that is echoed across kind of all the operations I'm involved with. And so we're not in any of this for the short term. We're in it for the long term.
So, James, one thing that you've dealt with this in that perspective, looking more long term, what is your philosophy? Well, there's a difference when you own it versus leasing it. And as far as do you have a long term, maybe some of the guys that are listening here have got 3 to 5 years and they feel like that's a long term lease in the cattle business. What do you say about that with that perspective? Or how do
Yeah,
you approach that?
sure. In the simplest answer, it is leave something better than you found it. And there was a tradition of people that leased country that kind of pillaged the place and left it
Sure.
barren. And part of that was a reaction from these short term leases, right? 1 year, 3 year leases. We try to not, we don't do any leases for less than 5 years, and we try to hit 10 years, especially with the current cattle market and everything. By the time you buy heifers and put them out there and whatever other terms you have in that lease, you're going to need a little bit of a safety net in case this thing turns down. And by the time you're selling calves, you're just not going to be able to pay back your input. And so I think that those two on the lease side, that, and then on the ownership side, obviously, we quote on the King Ranch side that Robert E. Lee told King Ranch, buy land and never sell. And everybody nowadays is kind of saying that. But that doesn't mean we've never sold. We've had to at times. And,
Sure.
but as often as possible, we want to hold on to it. And when you hold on to land for generations, you really can't get bogged down into the quarterly or annual returns as much as you need to be looking at what is the 10-year, 20-year, or like Dave said, the 100-year decision. And I feel like with the direction that you see ranches today, that is a larger concern. Even if somebody wants to potentially sell a place within so
Hmm.
many years, they need to sell something that promotes well over social media, or if they want to just use it for hunting, which is a lot of lease country that's available out there is kind of absentee owners that want to have a good getaway place in hunting, but they don't want to fool with the cattle operation on a day-to-day basis. And so you've got to be able to say that we are here to make your place better. And that's what we're mostly talking about. Yes, profitable for sure. But what are the most important things that you're concerned with as a landowner in terms of how do you want to see the place improve? And then kind of focus anything you're doing, owned or leased, based around that.
Sure. When you're looking at, say, a ranch to buy, is there a metric that you're using from a dollar cost per animal unit that you're trying to get to, regardless of where it is? I've talked to several older folks that they were always looking at the cow calf pair per $10,000. Now that's obviously shifted with inflation, but what kind of metric do you look at if you're trying to evaluate a purchase of a ranch? And do you look at all revenue streams, whether that's hunting, mining, oil and gas, wind, solar? Kind of give us your approach.
That's what we all heard about 20 years ago on the 10,000 a pair. And then, and to your point, like we need to update that because it's not in line with Texas anymore. And then also, if you do those numbers on most places, you're looking at 80 to 100 plus years on a return on investment if you're looking at it from just directly that. One, there's got to be something more important than just the return if you're going to own land. And that's a beauty in the eye of the beholder, I guess, is what is most important to that individual or group that is purchasing. And now we're seeing a lot of these big groups out there that are buying land as a portfolio asset. It's not a new idea, but I feel like I've never seen the demand that you're seeing nowadays. But to your point, we like to look at everything that is not for the long-term detriment of the land. And so even if you go into something that you might not want to look at for a few years, hey, is it still better to carry this thing for another generation? The other thing too, if you can get into any one project that can fund the rest of the operation, and I'm being intentionally vague because there's so much diversity out there now of what you can do with land. And I guess the only thing that I would stick completely away from in the discussion is development in terms of homes, turning that land
Sure.
over. Because that's one thing that I think you and I would
Texas
agree
is,
on.
yeah, we're seeing that in a big
So
way.
Chad Ellis's line from a few months ago, and it could be worse than that, but we're losing 1,023 acres a day to development. And
Wow.
uh, and I say that as often as possible. And in some rooms, people will be reactive and say, "Are you saying that people shouldn't be able to build homes?" We all know that there's a lot of land out there that could be converted that is already not in agriculture. What can we do to focus on that? And so I don't want to be, as often as possible, we don't want to be part of that transition. It sometimes happens. I'm not saying we've not done it, but as often as possible, we want to keep ranching as the main thing. And ranching is now encompassing much more than livestock.
Absolutely. What breed do you run? Your family heritage. What do you feel good about future of the cattle industry? What are you building your program on? Obviously, we know King Ranch is big with Santa Gertrudis heritage, and the Beggs. What's their cow base?
Yeah, unique from King Ranch, or not unique, but not with any influence from King Ranch. Beggs for about 50 years has been running Santa Gertrudis Hereford cross cows and
Okay.
some Angus too on first calf heifers in our country outside of the DFW area. But King Ranch, again, I've looked up to a lot of the people that have been involved in the development of the breed, especially the last 20 years on King Ranch, not the development, but the improvement of the breed. And we tell people that we're hanging choice prime over 90% on most of our cattle now at King Ranch, and we're over 90% on weaning rates. And both the numbers are constantly getting better. I remember there was our best bull back in the teens at King Ranch. The cattle manager at the time pointed to it and said, "That's the top one in the herd right now." And I remember I left for Marines for a few years, but I came back for a visit, and I remember seeing that bull out by the visitor center. I went and saw him, and I go, "Hey, that bull you told me was number one a couple of years ago, he's out by the tour bus." He goes, "He's not number one anymore." And he'd fallen way down the pecking order just in that 2-year period. And now he was just living with longhorns. And he still, phenotypically, he still looked fantastic, but there was a
Sure.
lot of other traits that just weren't measuring up anymore. And so, with that being said, we don't try to, on our personal cattle operation, we don't try and reinvent the wheel. Almost all the heifers we buy are King Ranch bred heifers. All the bulls we buy, except sometimes on first calf heifers or some direct to consumer stuff we've done over the years. Sometimes we'll throw in some Japanese or some straight Angus there for low birth weight calves or for replacement heifers for third party customers. But for our commercial, 90% of the genetics we buy are from King Ranch. And so we're just always on the waiting list for basically whenever they have availability. So in the current name there is American Cruise, and that's the newest name, but it's really been a transition from the Santa Cruz. It was a Red Angus Gelbvieh Santa Gertrudis. We removed the Gelbvieh over time because we felt like that the Santa Gertrudis and the Red Angus could now perform in everything that we added the Gelbvieh for in the 80s. And so our commercial cattle are some percentage Red Angus Santa Gertrudis, just anywhere from 25 to 25-75 or 50-50 either direction, and then crossed the opposite way when you get the bull on them. And so it just so happens that all three of the operations I'm involved with are Santa Gertrudis primarily, with either Hereford or Red Angus based on where we are.
I know there's been a lot of questions. I've had a lot of our followers reach out asking questions about Santa Gertrudis because it's not the mainstream breed. I mean, it's a smaller breed, and you guys are rich in history and heritage with that breed, and so you know it very well. I think it's interesting because those cattle work all over the U.S. People just don't realize it. And
I'll chime in actually. Keaton Dodd was just hired to be the head of SGBI. And as I was looking at kind of the sustainability side of things, I believe, and again, we're all biased, right? Because we're in it.
sure,
But I believe that there is no more adaptive animal in the beef world outside of Santa Gertrudis. We just had a study that is not promoted well enough. Utah State, and they fed cattle in the cold up there in northern Utah, and the Santa Gertrudis outperformed all other crossbreeds in that. The straight Santa Gertrudis, not even the cross. And so
yeah,
people that say it's just a hot weather animal, I see you nodding, that's not true. We've proven that in many regions. The breed itself went through in the 80s and 90s, went through because everybody was pushing for the biggest animals. And so it kind of plateaued and took a downturn. And then in the 90s and 2000s, King Ranch and then also the breed itself did a lot of work to bring that back. I was actually listening to a podcast that was kind of interesting. Lee Leachman, his dad, other people came in to King Ranch in the 80s and did a big whiteboard session for a week to figure out what is the direction King Ranch should take the cattle program. And that's where the Santa Cruz was born out of that. But the comment made back then, 30 years ago, just over, was it'll take you about 30 years to just breed up the Santa Gertrudis to what you're trying to achieve. But in the meantime, you can make these crosses to fill those gaps. And I was just listening to this podcast and I saw him later and I said, that's funny because, and he made the comment too. He goes, I wonder how it's going today. It's going great. I'm not saying it takes 30 years every time, but there were some things that had to get ironed out. And I really believe in the breed, and F1 crosses on many animals are all, many different breeds are great. And so that's why we like that Red Angus and Hereford, those crosses, but there's a lot of other great crosses out there.
you bet. Yeah, we've got Santa Gertrudis also, and we've crossed some with Red Angus, and I love the outcome. And you can market those calves anywhere in the country, and you have no issues. It's pretty neat.
I'm glad I'm preaching to the choir.
Well, maybe some of our listeners will look at what we've got to offer down here in Texas.
Yes, sir.
At what moment, what pulled you towards the ag tech sector?
When I became a landman, when you're working for a landowner as a landman, you're kind of a catch-all for kind of everything that's not animal related. So you're not really doing the wildlife, you're not really doing the livestock. But I always tell people power lines, fence lines, and pipelines was one thing. We were going through a long series of a lot of those projects. And then also just a variety of other things in the oil and gas world. We looked at a lot of renewable projects. We just looked across the board. But Exxon and B Carbon out of Rice University, Jim Blackburn, they did a study on 17 ranches across the Midwest. And actually, that study, I'd like to say before the end of this year, it'll come out. A pretty extensive white paper on that project that was measuring the same places on ranches 3 years in a row to show the carbon fluctuations in those soils. So as part of my role, I was meeting those people in the field and taking them to their points. And my boss, Lars Derud, is a astrophysicist. This is his third company. He's an entrepreneur. He sold two companies basically to Google Earth. There's a few other layers there, but I'll just leave it at that.
Mm-hmm.
And he made the comment, he goes, we're trying to be the Google Earth of soil. And then the other comment that was said is we're trying to get to where our data is so strong we don't have to take a soil sample. Now we might never get there, but in terms of not taking a soil sample, but we've grown immensely. So a couple months later, I called Lars and I said, you know what a landman is? And this is before the TV show came out. And he said, not really. And I explained to him that 100 years ago, a landman was really the crucial middleman between oil and gas and landowners to kind of recruit and spread the word about this opportunity. And I said, the carbon wheel is stuck in the hands of the scientists, the environmentalists, the climate tech people. But on the carbon credit side, I don't think that's being explained to ranchers well enough. And I actually just did a case study now 3 years later. Our personal experience combined with kind of ranch data throughout Texas, just showing typical cash flows on cattle and wildlife compared to carbon. And we're already seeing that carbon is exceeding those independently, those streams. And in the very near future, it could significantly exceed cattle and wildlife as the most productive thing you can do on a ranch outside of something extreme like renewables, oil and gas, et cetera.
Okay.
But so in the course of this, I was riding around and I love the fact that our company is more like the middleman between so many of these projects. So the main thesis of our company in the beginning 6 years ago was agronomy. So trying to teach a farmer to better understand his or her soil. And then instead of broadcasting everything everywhere, where can you understand your soil better and only do an input, do tilling, do those practices where it is needed, but learning the compaction, the nutrients, the biology of your soil, the carbon, and then making a reactive assessment and input based on that data. And carbon was an offshoot of that because we could measure carbon at scale accurately. Then a big part of our business is measuring carbon credits for all these developers that are out there, the people that actually aggregate the ranches, bring the buyer demand, and then make the transaction. But we're the ones that are actually pulling the data. And with that, I started just learning the world of AgTech and trying personally to utilize as a customer in ranching, use the things that would actually help me.
Absolutely.
And then also personally trying to be an investor advisor and try to work with the companies that I felt like had the best shot to not just improve health and morale of a ranching operation, but also what could be perhaps the most disruptive. And understanding the farmer is very much in tune to his or her soil. Rancher, they're always looking at productivity in terms of what's growing on the surface, right? And we've got a lot of studies on forage and grass coverage over soil, et cetera. But we don't really know enough about the soil. And mostly because that's been too expensive and it didn't make sense for a rancher to do it. So I want to be part of a company that was trying to better understand that, because if you take care of your soil, you take care of the entire operation. And then with that, I got involved now I'm on the board for RanchBot, which is a farm bot out of Australia, but now moved to the US. And one of the most mundane, and to quote Andrew Coppin that's over there, is he's always saying 90% of the time ranchers are spent checking waters that don't need to be checked.
Sure.
And so how can we save that mileage? How can we save that labor cost? How can we get a guy out of a truck for a couple hours a day and maybe get him on a horse, or get him to check cows, or get him to do something that's going to improve him as an operator, or improve the ranch that's outside of just something that could be automated. And then also met Frontiers Market, that's an artificial intelligence gathering company where you use any phone, GoPros or your cell phone. And as we say, it is trying to not replace, but the thing we're losing in ranching is that steady 30, 40-year employee that really understands that country, those cattle, that operation. Whether that's people don't want to stay in that job long enough, whether they want to move to that job in another place, whatever. And so to replicate what the eye can pick up, so all the phenotypical traits of an animal, all the
Mhm.
health, and then all of the things that perhaps you could generate from the eyeball, making a computer learn that so that when you do check cows, you can scan them with your phone or one cow at a time. You can get facial and body recognition. You can understand if there's a health issue based on their gait or however they're moving around. And then all the other things that, again, an old rancher, an old cowboy would have picked up. But nowadays, because people have their phones, and that was another funny thing too, is like the phone is the death of good ranching observations, but we could switch that and make it the tool that solves the issue because it can understand better,
Yeah.
faster, and then report it and all that. And so those are three of the companies that I'm directly involved with. And they just, from meeting people and going around and being on things on podcasts like this with you, you just start to learn who these people are, what they're doing, and then also the value of human capital in all of this because there's a lot of good ideas out there and there's a lot of bad ideas. The bad ideas need to go away sooner. The good ideas need somebody that understands ranching and farming, that landman type that can translate the technology, the gap, what is the
There is a
need,
gap.
yeah, into the operation and say, hey, this is what we're solving. Whether it's that P&L, this is the money you're going to save, or this is the money you're going to make, or this is how you're going to improve your operation just because of efficiencies. And I know there's a lot of money being poured into all of this, but just like many other things, the people that often develop these markets or these technologies, what is the real issue that the rancher really needs? That's what I'm trying to be in the middle of, whether they want me to be or not.
Sure. So let's go back to the carbon credit piece because I've had a lot of ranchers, a lot of farmers reaching out about carbon credits. And I think this industry has evolved a lot in the last 5 years. A lot of, I guess, the payouts, a lot of that has evolved from the early days. I think a lot of people either kind of felt like from a paperwork standpoint and what the return was, it wasn't worth playing with. So then they just kind of throw it hands in the air. But it has evolved quite a bit. My rancher clients have just not really looked at they have not looked at carbon credits. Their farmer buddies have said, hey, we've looked into that and it's not worth it. And so they don't even go down the road. And I wonder, is there a disconnect? Like, why are some of the ranchers not understanding? The farmers, I feel like, are a little more in tune because they're out there plowing the dirt, where a rancher's growing grass, leaves it covered. I mean, there's a lot of different practices, but it's a whole lot different managing rangelands than it is a corn and soybean farm in Iowa. Can you kind of talk a little bit to that as far as like maybe what our ranching community maybe misunderstanding about these carbon credits and how much of a revenue stream they may possibly be?
Sure. The issue we've seen is that, like you said, it's been a 20 plus year development and it's kind of ebbed and flowed over time. The farmers and ranchers that are turned off to it, it's like they had the conversation 5 years ago, 10 years ago, whatever. And then when they saw that current value, when they saw the current contracts, they wrote it off and never checked in again. Go back to oil and gas in the 20s and 30s when it was just getting going. And somebody made some money, but it wasn't enough. I don't want to look at those things. They're not paying me enough. It's like saying, I'm never going to look at it again, even when my neighbor is now driving a Cadillac and doing all these things. And then same with renewables too. Like renewables were thrown out the door 20, 30 years ago because it just wasn't worth it for people. And then now you see it's still a very hot button issue, right? But you see ranchers being like, you know what? It's worth it now. Like it is worth it for me and my family if I can do a project on a percentage of the land that's going to help me pay for and improve the other 70, 80, 90% of the land. Carbon credits also, one is a little bit of a call to action here too, is the people that developed these markets weren't ranchers. There was a lot of book work and office work, and they didn't get out and understand what is realistic? What is an operation doing? What should it be doing? Is it doing it the best it can? How tolerant are they to drought, et cetera? And so I guess what I'll say to your point is that just in the last 3 years that I've been very involved in it, we've seen the credit price double. And so now it went from, oh, I don't know if it's worth it. I don't want to tie my land, et cetera, to now it's so significant that you can't look away.
Sure.
And the other thing that's interesting is, we as landowners, some of us have gotten involved and made these contracts, these protocols more realistic for a region or more adaptive to an operation because what works in one region won't work in another. And so that doesn't mean you just say that, hey, these things need to happen here or there, because there are protocols, there are things that you have to account for because part of it, and the other thing ranchers don't like is somebody looking over their shoulder. And somebody
Sure.
has to look over your shoulder to justify and defend the value of your credits to a buyer that's out there. And the other thing that is the biggest probably difference is that the demand has outpaced supply in such a big way. So Fortune 200, 300 companies are out there putting incredible commitments, tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars per company to make these commitments. And people always get carbon mixed up with other carbon projects that are out there that are very government subsidized. And
Sure.
this is not that. This is a free market. This is this company committing $100 million of purchasing of reductions for themselves because they are committed to a reduction. And so people will think that's not my brand of politics or whatever. It doesn't matter what your brand is. This is something they're going to pay you to basically keep ranching. And there's more detail than that I can give you on just this podcast. Like you've got to understand it more. But if you look away, then this demand will keep growing and the supply will grow at a steady clip. And somebody else will get something that you're not going to be able to get. Now, the demand is so huge now that you could have 100 ranchers come sign up after this podcast and it won't even put a dent in it. And so, yet, are they going to ask you to sign up for 15, 30 or more years? Generally, not more than 30, but yes. So, you've got to decide generationally, am I going to keep this ranch for another generation? Or are my kids committed to this? And then, two, you're going to have to decide not only am I going to keep the land, am I going to keep it in ranching? And I'm going to continue to be a good steward of the land. None of these things are outrageous for a rancher. So telling a rancher to keep their land for the rest of their life and to keep ranching on it is what a rancher is going to do anyways. But I guess the best news is just that the demand, the price of these credits is growing so quickly. And then again, you look at direct air capture or other carbon projects that are out there, and they're paying over $100 a ton because it was lobbied and subsidized and those kind of things. And it still could be a viable opportunity there, but there is no ceiling to what these carbon credits are worth. And when, as a rancher, unlike a traditional oil and gas lease where you're signing for a flat rate on a percentage of or a max or a per acre or whatever, you're signing up for a market price. So as the market drives up, you are taking advantage of that increase in the price. And then most of the developers are out there too. They're taking a percentage. They're not taking a flat rate. So it is their concern to make these credits worth more faster. So getting the best buyers out there, pitting those buyers against each other to make them spend the most money on the credit. And so again, a rancher is benefiting from everything I just said.
Let's just say, James, we've got a Central Texas ranch, kind of improved grasses, maybe a little mix of some native. Like, what would your estimation be on what someone could look at? We're going to use a per acre basis.
So the study I just sent you, the carbon information is based on my personal experience because it's all of this is very private. There's no public domain that says what in Texas is the average on a
Sure.
per acre or per region, whatever. In our experience, 0.51 tons per acre per year to a range to 1.4 tons per acre per year. That is where the 4 contracts we've signed are between that left and right, or that top and bottom. And at the current price is $30 to $35 a ton. So just if we say that price, we're getting somewhere between $15 and $50 per acre on our place. And so I'll challenge a rancher, not in terms of a revenue, but in terms of a net. What are they making on a per acre on cattle, wildlife, or ecotourism, or dude ranches, or whatever is their enterprise? It'd be very hard for them to look themselves in the mirror and say that they are making a net of between 15 and 50 on any one cash flow opportunity on their ranch. Now, when you combine, yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of ranchers out there making 50, 60, $80 an acre when you take all in. But that is where we are today. And just 3 years ago when we started, this thing was at $16 a ton. Cut those numbers in half, $7 to $25 if on the current modeling that I've gotten. And then again, the conservative estimate by 2030 is we're looking at $55 to $60 a ton. So almost another double. The high end estimate is as much as $150 a ton on these credits. So now, again, that's a 5X on what I just said. So now take that again and say, okay, around 70 as a minimum dollars per acre, all the way up to $250 an acre. Like now we're talking life changing money for an operation. And not only life changing, but maybe decision changing, meaning instead of turning your place into a shopping mall, you're actually looking at, hey, I'm on the edge of whatever city, but this is now enough money that I can look at my family in the eye and say, we're going to do this. We're going to do it for 30 years. Even if it's at the minimum, that's still money in your pocket and we can keep
Sure.
ranching with that additional income. But if it's at the maximum, we're talking about you can now raise your family and send them to college on ranching. And you can now do the things that as ranchers we found unattainable. And the other thing I think we notice in ranching is that when market goes up, we all talk about how much money we're making on cattle, but there's not enough reinvestment of that additional income back into the operation. There's merely just a paying down of debt, maybe buying better bulls, maybe buying better replacement heifers, like fixing some fences. But in
Mhm.
terms of like really taking the time and energy into adding additional income, that when this market drops again one day, something is there, as I said in this article, to steady the ship. Something is going to keep that ranch in a cash flow positive operation, no matter the cattle market. And that's where we need to get to if we're going to recruit people to be in ranching, if we're going to maintain ranches and ranch lands, if we're going to slow down this development of Texas and U.S. lands.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's going to be another revenue stream. And like you said, I just recently, I've had a couple ranchers, young guys that are looking at financing some big operations. There's some government help there. We're looking at the carbon credit side of it, the cattle operation piece. There's a lot of facets to this. And I think ranchers really need to, the day of just being the cowboy are kind of gone. And I think they need to look at the business from the core of the earth to the tip top of the universe. Everything in between, you've got to be able to manage and create revenue with for longevity's sake, too. We want to do what's right. I think really deep down, most all ranchers are truly stewards of the land, the grass, the trees, the streams, the water, everything in our path. We want to take care of it.
And I'll even, a slight argument to what you just said is actually a lot of these things are going to allow people to be cowboys again, because we've kind of made ranching just an administrative job. And then usually, just like I've got a town job to pay for my ranching habit. And if we can flip that back to where it's no, I did right by the land and now I can cowboy again and I
Yeah.
can raise my kids to do this. That's really the goal for me, is like getting ranchers to be able to be ranchers again and not be working on all other things so that they can
But
keep their ranch.
yeah,
Uh,
not having to be a pencil pusher, because that's the way it feels nowadays. Is you cannot stump your toe anywhere. And I think a lot of guys feel that pressure to keep things moving. Well, let's go to Earth Optics. Now, they can really help out in this situation. If a rancher's wanting to kind of develop a profile for their ranch to be able to market carbon credits, that's where you guys come into this picture, isn't it?
on just the carbon side of the business, one is the measurement of soil for the sake of offsets, or what's called scope one. And scope one is merely selling offsets from your land through these developers. And the other thing I'll encourage ranchers to know is that you're not paying for anything in this transaction. The only thing you'll pay for is when you sign a contract, you're going to want to hire a lawyer and do your red lines. And so your legal fees and your time to talk about your operation. But the payment to Earth Optics comes through the sale of credits. And so the rancher doesn't pay us, doesn't sign a contract with us most of the time. Some ranchers that have enough scale and have enough of their own connections will hire us to measure their soil and get their own credits verified and then sell their credits. That's the 100,000 plus acre crowd can manage to do
Sure.
that. And even at that scale, it's still depending on the health of the operation. And then the other thing that we've been working on, so scope 2 is kind of, if you look at the three scopes as they call them of carbon, scope 1 is offset, scope 2 is through your kind of value chain a little bit, and then scope 3 is basically your commodity. And so scope 2 gets a little bit tougher, but that's like you changing the way you're shipping your cattle basically and trying to quantify that. And so for ranching, it's very applicable to retail and to stores like that. But on the scope 3 side, the same data that we're gathering at the soil side, and then we did our first one of these was last year with a company called Kupali Rum. Kupali Rum is a carbon negative bottle of rum. And so because the way they farm, because the way they grow their cane, because of the bottles and labels and everything in their value chain and how that we quantify all of that information so that when they do sell you that bottle of rum, it is a carbon negative bottle and they can put a value on that. And that's another thing I think ranchers should realize is regenerative is a value add, like organic was or still is, like grass fed, like any of that. It's a label that people want to put on their product now and make that claim and add that value to it. But there's now a healthy amount of people trying to put all the qualifications together for carbon neutral or carbon negative beef. And you and I both know that what a cow does to the soil is an improvement on the soil because it's replicating the grazing animals that were the bison and that effect. And then I also point to the fact that feed yards are very conscious of the natural resources they're using, how much diesel they're paying to make their trucks put the feed out, the type of feed they're getting, where they're getting it in their radius, because it's cheaper to get the local stuff. They're some of the best people in terms of saying an actual amount of resources and funds allocated to the growing of protein. And so now you're looking at a feeding operation can claim reductions or neutrality based on how they're sourcing their animals, what the operation was prior to, when they purchase, when they take it through their feeding operation, and when they take it to market. And so that's another thing too is it's a little bit of a sense of if you don't use it, you lose it in terms of if you're a rancher and you're doing right, but you're just, I'm not going to do carbon credits. Somebody's going to put that value on your animal down the chain if you did not. Now, if you're sitting there selling offsets or attaching that scope 3 to your commodity, then you as the rancher is going to take advantage of that. If not, it's going to get further down and they're going to see that nothing is attached to it because through air tags, through facial recognition, through contracts, like obviously we can track that beast and where it went through its life. And so that's the other kind of thing to look out for ranches is if you're not doing this yourself, somebody else is probably doing it. And then the buyers too, like they should be very in tune to the fact that what are the animals that they're buying and what was their life cycle prior to. Life cycle analysis, the LCA is another way to point this to. So it's the analysis of the animal from calving to death. And that is how we're able to quantify this and then again monetize that. And so there's different ways to play. And that's another reason I love Earth Optics is if you want a carbon solution, there's multiple directions we can go with this. And we can go anywhere from taking all the data, compiling and do the lab analysis and everything, to coaching you through the process, to putting the buyers together with the sellers, which is not official. That's more of a relationship. There's many ways to play in this space. And again, carbon, people are already kind of sick of hearing about carbon, but carbon's the beginning. We saw a few months ago that Microsoft purchased Indigo water credits, Indigo being another developer of carbon credits. But they bought water credits because they were building a data center. They were going to use water for that data center. And they said, we need to offset our water usage. So we need to go pay a rancher to maintain good use of their water. And then the other thing that's being developed is biodiversity credits would be an aggregate of all of these things together and just saying, look, these are healthy lands overall. Perhaps that just becomes part of a carbon credit and just adds value to that credit, which is another reason we're racing this price up. Or perhaps it's independent of.
There's just been a lot of mystery within that carbon credit space. I've get more emails and text via social media and people wanting to find out more. And I think it's an evolving space. I think it legitimately, what you and I are talking about today, it may evolve so much in the next year and a half, 2 years, that it may be double or triple where we're at today. The globe operates with finance and the ESG mandates. I think that's something that a lot of folks don't keep up with because in the US we're not really following those ESG mandates, but the globe is. And if you're a global company and you're seeking financing out of Switzerland or wherever the case may be, you're probably going to have to adhere to those and you're going to have offset credits for whatever the practice that you're working from. So I think it's important that we educate and we continue to get this message out there. Let's shift gears a little bit. Now, the land board plus legacy thinking. This is our next segment here. What is the land board and how does it work alongside a service like Empire Ag?
My dad had a 40-year career. Really, it's still going because 40 years with King Ranch, but then add on another 10 years working with other family ag enterprises. And then basically kind of his old leadership team that retired or has moved to other roles that we really feel like we did a lot of good when we worked together at different points in our life. There's two landmen, there's a real estate person, there's a farmer, there's a financial person, there's a person with a lot of experience in ranching, there's somebody involved in family business, somebody involved from insurance. And all of these people have enough of knowledge in all of those things I just mentioned, but they have their specialty. And so the idea was if an operation wanted to have a board, but maybe they didn't feel like they could pay for outside board members, then this would be a kind of plug and play board that can show up, get your reporting, find out all the holes they can, whether that takes a day or whether that's we're onboarded for a few months or whatever the timeline is, and kind of help understand and utilize the lessons learned from the shared experience of the group. And I'm the least experienced person by a long shot on there. Most of them average 40 to 60 years of experience in agriculture and business, and et cetera. Mm-hmm. And it's very much trying to serve the greater industry from that vantage point. Is it consulting? Yes, but it was trying to look at a different model of the traditional consulting model in a sense. So often they get hired on as consulting for those particular things, but which is also telling for us in terms of too often a rancher or a farmer is only telling you what they know their problem is. And the King Ranch Institute that we've all been very involved with didn't coin this term, but is very much on the systems thinking approach where it's pull the entire operation apart, figure out where the issues are, and then build it back as a stronger whole. So often the people that are living it every day are not the ones that can diagnose. It really needs an outside body that can do that. Mm-hmm. And that is probably what we would encourage people to do. But, if somebody says, I just want you to help me market my calves better, or I want you to help me with this particular project, that's often what we get recruited to do, even though it's not what we would recommend with a lot of operations.
You say this is a complementary tool. How does it help producers plan for the long game? Because like you said, we were talking about these problems that we're trying to put a Band-Aid on or maybe gear us, but are you guys really instrumental in kind of working through that long-term planning process?
Absolutely. And that, in a nutshell, it would be creating the strategic plan, creating the long-term plan, not really in the execution. We've helped people hire people and then they're the ones that go on and at the operational or tactical levels. But it's really, we're trying to sit at the strategic level where it's like, where do you want to get to eventually? And then these are the things you should do to get there. And then in terms of implementation, that is not the role. But I look at, and with a lot of other consulting groups out there in the ag world, there's not nearly as much in the ag world as there are in other business channels. And it's a big world out there, hundreds of millions of acres of ag land in this country. And there are a lot of lessons that could be learned from a lot of different operations. And so the complementary side too, with Empire Ag or with other folks is, look, there's certain strengths that everybody's going to have and certain backgrounds that you're going to want to leverage. It's kind of like the carboning world. Like I'm still in the point where I want everybody to get along because there's so much opportunity out there that there doesn't need to be a competition or a fight over any particular place. And I think in ag consulting, we're still very much in that place too.
I would concur with that because I think a lot of it goes back to relationships. And if you want to work with me or you want to work with James, we've got to have that relationship and we want to like who we're working with, period. And that's where I've felt my wife and I've very strongly about that, that I don't feel like there's a whole lot of competition in the ag space because there's so many of us. The U.S. is a very vast place, and we've got opportunity abound for all of us.
You and I talked about this last time, but too often are just giving people a 3 hour conversation without any contract. And it's just, look, let me just help this person as best I can. And then let me introduce them to Empire and all of that. And I challenge others to help others ranch and farm better. But you need 20, 30, 50 years of experience before you can just sit back and tell somebody how to be better at something. And so
Yeah.
that's where with Empire too, I know that you have very much a senior team in that regard too. Land Board, it was built on that. We didn't wake up and go to a school that taught us this. It was, and again, I removed myself from it because I'm still very much in the training phase, I guess. But these are the hard lessons learned. We can help you avoid the big breakdowns. And that is what's most frustrating. And that's what you see. One of the slides I put up in my conversation about the development, we already talked about the loss of natural resources with the development of land in Texas, but it's also the culture. And for years, people have been saying, oh, there's no more cowboys and all that. We know there's plenty of cowboys still out there. But the bigger concern for me is we're losing ranchers. We're breaking up ranches and we're losing ranches that can sustain. And that's the bigger problem because if you don't have ranches, you're not going to be able to employ cowboys. And so it's like, why are these people giving up? Why are they selling out? Why are they breaking up? Why are they not being productive? And how do we help senior management or the owners solve that problem so that we can maintain this culture in Texas and this country, which is very important to us too?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think a lot of times it's hard whenever you have owners that were not, maybe they weren't born into an active operation. Maybe they had a business. They went in, they bought a big ranch because it was a play pretty. It was something they wanted to do, check off on the box. But we've got to be able to walk them through that process on how to have something that is sustainable for the next generation and why it's important for the community. There's a lot of land mass across this country that if this ranch employs 5, 6 people, that's important for that little community there. It's just something we've got to keep ranches and farms growing across this country, not more consolidation, in my opinion. But
Absolutely. And that's the only way we recruit the next generation. We keep saying, I don't know the current stat, but the average owner operator of ranches in his late 60s, I think. And we've got to solve that by making these places more productive. You cannot be a passive rancher and just maintain anymore. You've got to be very much in it and trying to figure out how to make it better.
we've come to the unfiltered section or segment of the show. And this will be just firing off. We've got some quick questions here, and then you just answer them the best way you can. You've been on both sides as a rancher and a tech innovator. Where is agriculture getting in its own way?
I guess back to kind of what I mentioned earlier is there's too much money being poured into things that don't work well enough, like they're not ready for prime time yet. Focusing on the things that are not going to scale and not going to be effective or are just not needed. Somebody joked the other day that, oh, one day it'll just be robots working cattle. And so that just defeats the purpose because that's the fun part. Why are we focusing on the part that is the best recruiting tool we have? And so that's on the tech side. On the ag side, it's back to what you said about carbon credits is we've got to quit. There's still the attitude, and this is not new, but where I'm not going to figure that out. I'll just let the next generation toy with that. Well, and then that person stays in that seat for another 15 years, and then the next generation just has to sell the ranch because they never adapted.
Sure.
And I always point to the fact that, look, our ancestors didn't get into ranching like people do nowadays because they just want to wear a cowboy hat and want to claim their brand and everything. They got into it because it was profitable. And we've got to understand that agriculture was pursued for all these years because it was a money making enterprise. And we've somehow turned that on its head where it's no, it's just a quality of life thing. It's like, no, it is not. Because the quality of life will burn out on you. And if people keep treating agriculture like it's their lake house, then we're going to keep killing the culture.
I love that. That'll make a highlight reel right there. Agriculture treating it like a lake house. I love it. I'll have to remember that. For a producer overwhelmed by all of this, where do you think they need to start? What's first thing on their list?
Yeah, podcasts and webinars. I know you're doing one, but it's like you don't have to go to a town hall meeting. You don't have to go to a whatever convention anymore. You can get everything you need to know right here. Now, I pursue that next step, which is the in person at those events, but there are too many ways. Not to mention YouTube itself. I'm not YouTube savvy, but I know people that have built careers and professions out of what they learned on YouTube. I was with a guy the other day who was filming a movie here, and he said, I went to YouTube University. And I was just like, I knew what that meant. But I go, specifically, what do you mean? He's like, I didn't go to any school to learn how to work a camera or to film movies. I literally learned it all on YouTube. What we have at our fingertips now, we are not using the tools we have. And so a producer can easily focus on those certain things they want to focus on, or even a podcast like this that's going to talk about multiple subjects. And just commit to that. Turn off the radio and turn on the podcast when you're on that long drive.
You got another one. This is a hot button one we're going to close out with. All right. If a guy's looking for a ranch horse right now, Beggs or King Ranch?
It depends. How about that answer? Yeah, I'll give him a single answer. They're going to have to wait a year now because it was just a couple weeks ago, but Beggs and King Ranch do a horse sale together. The Return to Bermuda sale at 4-6's hosts it. And there's 6 total ranches, 150 horses, but my personal horses are actually, I've got a Beggs stud and King Ranch type mares, and then I'm going either direction in the future too. So I can't decide. I'm too proud of both of the lineages to stick one flag in the sand.
I understand. Very diplomatic. I appreciate you doing that. You've seen ag from horseback and from a drone. What's your vision for the future of production agriculture, and what's it going to take for us to get there?
We have a digital twin is one of the tools we use. And for those that don't know what that is, that's basically running models where it's like, hey, I've got a piece of land. What is the best thing I can do here? So based on soil type, based on elevation, rainfall, all of the data you can implement into there. And I say that not just as an Earth Optics plug, which I always will, just like we were talking about the podcast, there are too many tools out there that can get you past what used to be the first 10 or 20 years of just trying to figure it out. How many stories have we heard where usually when somebody dies, right, then all of a sudden the son or daughter took over the ranch and they were young or they had a job in town. Now they got to figure out ranching. And it's like with all of the tools that are out there, and especially on the soil side, the water side, the livestock side, like with those big question marks that are there are ways that you can get past those difficult years. I'm not saying they're going to bring your ranch to a perfect state or farm. They're not going to get you right to perfect, but they're going to get you past the time when you really fall on your face most often, which are the most dangerous, because that's when somebody has to say, I've got to sell the place, or I've got to offload a significant amount of my herd, or completely change something. This artificial intelligence is fantastic because it's not going to get you the answer, but it'll get you past biggest wrong answers. And so that's really some of the best stuff we've got there. And again, all of that is from your cell phone. You can make those adjustments. I always point to on the Earth Optics on the rangeland side, like people don't realize when they have a heifer pasture, the same heifer pasture, the same horse pasture, the same bull pasture for 50 years. Nature doesn't like that, not long-term consistency. It likes adaptation. I always point it to a human body, right? You don't do the same exercise every day of your life. You change it up constantly. And as your body adapts to all that change, that's how you have the most growth. It's the same with land, animals, and everything else. You've got to keep it guessing, but you need to understand that as early as possible, what are the things that are just not going to work? And what are the things I need to do to make that first and best and most significant change? Because that'll at least get you on a cash flow positive. And that's the other thing too. Everybody talks sustainability and regenerative. It's all great to talk about that. But if you're not cash flow positive, you cannot be any of those other things. And so step one first, is this place making money? Step two is, how can I make more money? How can I make it better? Like on our place, one place down here where I've got a great team. It's not a me thing, but we have a place down here where we have more cows than we've ever had. We have more grass. We have better soil. Water evaporates more slowly. Creeks run longer. Quail, deer are healthier, more prolific, and we're selling carbon credits. None of that was done in a vacuum. It was all of, how do I make the entire operation better? Now
Hmm.
every segment we have is making more money, and we have the additional carbon making money in addition to everything else making more money. That's what's important for an operation. And then back to, we're in ranching because we want to be ranchers. If it's that attitude, don't you want to be a good rancher? Don't you want to have better cattle? Don't you want something that you can be more proud of? And all of that kind of connects very nicely.
That's what the goal is. It's just it's tough, and I like that you said that because a lot of folks, the reason that they're apprehensive of changing anything is that they've hit that first phase of profitability, and then it's like, where do we go from here? Because we don't want to go backwards, but we just want to build on what we have, and so I think that's important. It's important.
Just as big of a wreck, if not bigger, is making too significant of a change too quickly without knowing what are the ramifications of that change.
Yep.
We talk about the cycle of an absentee landowner in South Texas. It used to be buy a piece of land. I don't have enough grass. Get rid of all the cows. I want quail. They're hunting for a season. It goes well. The next season, hey, I got too much grass and I'm not seeing my quail. Let's go ahead and start mowing and burning and doing all this. And now they're going, man, I'm spending a lot of money in this place. Remember 5, 8, 10 years ago when you got rid of all the cows? That was the beginning of a very bad decision that you thought was going to make this benefit, but it actually made the opposite effect. And that doesn't happen as much as it used to, but that used to be a very common trend in, especially in South Texas with a lot of ranches.
You bet. Well, James, I appreciate you being here, cutting through the noise. If you're listening and curious about what Earth Optics is doing or thinking about how soil strategy plays into the long game for your operation, check out their work and don't be afraid to ask questions. And guys, check out Frontier Markets and also RanchBot. There's just a lot of cool things that are going on in the tech space for ranching. And I think you guys ought to take a look at it. And if you're building something out there in ag and want to talk shop, we're always game for a conversation. Until next time, be good or be good at it.